When Owen said he's never going to talk to Lauryn again, I'm like, dude, are you blaming her for what happened to her? Are you blaming her for the messages that her mom was sending her? Maybe there's something that Netflix didn't show, but I can't fathom not talking to somebody who was actually victimized by this stuff, because all of those messages, those traumatic messages that were sent to her, telling her how terrible she was and the things about what she should do about her life and do to herself and her looks. I mean, those things, those were not her fault. And all of a sudden now you're going to blame her for that? I don't know. Maybe there's some reason for that. And we'll get into that here in a second. I'm Trey Tucker. I'm a mental health therapist, and we're here to make your 20s and 30s legendary. And specifically, I focus on guys most of the time. And in this series, the Netflix series, Unknown Number, there's a lot of focus on the psychological effect on the women. Kendra and Lauryn are the most prominent, and we've talked about those. I've done a video on each of those. You can watch it if you want. But today we're going to focus on the psychological effects of all of this horrendous situation on the men in this documentary, Owen and Shawn. And it's pretty much a microcosm of what happens in real life. There's not a whole lot of content out there talking about the psychological effects on men in a lot of the current events. So we're going to flip that on its head today. And as best I can, I'm going to dive into what I think might be going on with these guys based on what they're saying, based on some of the principles that I know just in general. And I'll talk about, like, here, if I were sitting with them in a conversation, here's what I would be curious about. Here's what I would ask them. And we're going to dig into some principles that we can all apply to become better men and to watch out for some of the toxic people and other dangerous people that could be out there and what to do about them. All right, let's start with Owen. If I were his therapist, here are the things that I would say, hey, I noticed in this interview, and here's what I'm curious about. I looked at your body language. I listened to the things you said. Here are just some things that I just wonder about. Again, I'm not his therapist. I'm not making any diagnoses of anything. I'm just going to say, look, here's what I noticed as I watched. So maybe let's tackle some of these things. The first thing that came to my mind was the attachment styles, because a situation like this, there's no way you're going to get out of a situation like he went through and not have some sort of damage to your ability to attach to somebody. The first one I figured is probably going to make him at least a little bit avoidant in his willingness to attach, or avoidant attachment style. There were hints in his body language of being a little bit walled off, a little bit stoic. He was open in his words, but there was just something about him. It was like, yep. It's almost just a hint of being kind of flippant, especially when he was talking about whether he was going to talk to Lauryn and what he thought about Kendra. And I know there's got to be still a ton of pain in there. And a lot of times when we get hurt, it causes us to retreat, at least emotionally. Sometimes our words can really be aggressive, but the words are meant to protect what's still going on inside, the pain. So like if you had a bruise, you wouldn't want somebody accidentally bumping up against your bruise. So you're going to have probably something to protect from that kind of pain, protect that bruise from getting hit again. And the same thing happens when we got emotional pain going on. We don't want that bruise to get hit, so we're going to do something to keep people away. And sometimes it's anger, sometimes it's kind of being stoic or a little bit flippant, or like, I don't care, just kind of giving off the vibe of like, nothing's going to affect me. And again, I don't know what the effect is on him, but that would be the first thing I would tackle with him. I could also see under that realm of attachment style, I could see the potential for there to be some anxious attachment. Because if he did finally let somebody in, then I could see it's like, oh my gosh, I finally found somebody I can trust. I got to hold on tight to this person so that they don't run away. And like, I got to make sure everything's okay all the time. And I need constant reassurance. And like, again, I didn't see any of that in the documentary, but I'm anticipating, like, if somebody does go through what he went through, I could see the nervous system choosing that route when it finally felt like it found someone worth trusting and worth building something with. Because again, if you remember back when he tried dating a different girl in a different city, Kendra's text still kept coming at him. So at some point he even said this, like, I don't want to start dating anybody else because I don't want to bring them into this horror. So those two things I think can work together. The anxious and the avoidant can almost work together at the same time, where like, I don't want to start dating anybody or letting somebody in because I don't know who I can trust and I don't want them to get hurt. And then also, if I actually did take that chance, then the anxious avoidant style or tendency might be still waiting in there to grab hold too tightly. So the attachment styles are one possible angle to look out for. But also, there's anytime a guy especially experiences what he went through where he was groomed and then also received all of those messages of such a vile, lewd sexual nature, that stuff can cause some shame because there's a voice in our heads a lot of times, especially as guys. And that voice, it's not really us. It's not the truth, but that voice will tell us that, like, this is a little bit your fault. And there's no logic to it. There's no set of like reasons why, but that voice is going to say, well, you should have been strong enough to keep this from happening, or you should have been able to stop this. It's like, again, it's nonsensical, but that voice harasses a lot of guys, and it's just pure shame. So anytime we're saddled with something like what he endured, I always want to see, all right, what messages is this guy telling himself? What story is he telling himself about what happened? Because what happened to us obviously has a massive impact, but what has even more of an impact is the meaning that we give to what happened to us. So yes, this stuff happened, and that means blank. That's what I would be extra curious about with Owen. And then also, there's this idea of like, there's a defense mechanism called overcompensation. And I don't know what his real life is like right now, but with all this attention, I could see maybe it's possible that maybe people look at him differently now. Maybe they potentially might admire him, or maybe they might pity him, or just see him as a partial person where they only saw that hour and a half special, but he's obviously much more than that. So I could see him potentially trying to appear maybe stronger or maybe smarter, whatever he thinks people see him as. He wants to be known as more than just a caricature. And so overcompensating and trying hard to project a certain image is another possible thing that he could be dealing with. He might have the temptation to put his whole identity into something else, like a sport he's playing right now, or just anything he can do to overly get away from this whole image that's being created on Netflix. And then finally, to build off of that idea of the attention that he's been getting, I would say, hey man, watch out for just the ego, because when we get publicity, when people start to know us, when that celebrity, quote unquote, starts to happen, it's sneaky, and it works its way in, and you can start feeling like, you're the head honcho, whatever. And it's just sneaky. I would just say, like, look, watch out and make sure that the fame of this doesn't really affect you, and let's figure out who you are and what gives you value separate from all of the public limelight that you're going to be getting. And now we move to Shawn, and he's such a mystery to me because Netflix didn't show a whole lot. So I'm going to try to dive into some of the things I noticed that Netflix either maybe hinted at or maybe didn't even realize they were showing us, that I can try to dig into this. All right. First thing, when he was hugging Lauryn at the end and telling her how much he loved her, that hug to me looked cold. It looked distant. It didn't look genuine. She wasn't really leaning into the hug, and he wasn't really gripping her tight. And I don't know, maybe they were doing it that way because they weren't comfortable knowing there were cameras around. I'm not sure. But throughout all of the interview with him, he seemed distant and cold and shut down. And I totally get it based on what he's been through. But I do wonder, has he locked himself up so much? Has his heart been shut off, and his ability to give love, has that been shut down and betrayed so much that he can't even give it to his daughter who needs it the most? And I would tell him this: your daughter needs you more than ever now. You're going to have to become the nurturer that Kendra never was, and that you thought she was. You thought you had this partnership where you were going to give certain traits and that Kendra was going to give certain traits to, but Lauryn needs you to become even more of that provider of the emotion as well. So I'm hoping that he's in some therapy. And based on some of the things that he said or the way that he said them, he seems to be getting a broader perspective now and seeing how he can cope with things. He was not stuck in anger mode based on that interview. Also, I noticed that he didn't lose his temper when I probably would have, when the police came and let him know that Kendra was the one sending the text. It was remarkable that he was able to keep his cool and say, all right, you got to leave, because if you stay, I'm going to do something that's going to get us both in trouble, and Lauryn's going to be taking, like, he knew that he had to keep his cool right then. So like, I love that about him, because a man is supposed to be strong and harness his emotion. That meekness, by the way, meekness is taking your strength and channeling it, strength under control. So it doesn't mean just weak and passive and apathetic. It means use your strength for good. And he kept his cool and stayed in his rational brain. So that part was great. I wondered though, and Netflix kind of hinted at this with Chloe's parents mentioning that somehow that Shawn might have been in on this with Kendra in some way, or they might have known about it. Plus, well, let me say it this way. I wonder if Shawn already knew that Kendra was the one sending the messages before the police even said it, because his reaction wasn't all that surprised. He was more surprised about the fact that she had been lying about the jobs that she had. He didn't get surprised about the text coming from Kendra's phone. Now, if you read some of the articles, because Netflix didn't talk about this, the articles talk about the police, before they ever confronted Kendra in the house, they had already told the family, Shawn, Kendra, and Lauryn, they already figured out that the messages were coming from somewhere inside the house. Netflix didn't talk about that. So I'm just wondering, did Shawn realize that it was Kendra all along, even before the police showed up, and maybe that's why he was able to keep his cool? I don't know. But the final piece of the Shawn puzzle that I noticed is that I just wonder, is he just a shell of a man right now who's in recovery, but I'm wondering, is he carrying around shame that I should have stopped this? I should have seen this coming somehow. I should have done something more. I should have known it earlier. Like, I don't know. It just seems like he's beating himself up a lot, just based on the body language. He didn't say anything about that in the documentary itself, but when you just watch his body language, he's kind of slumped. He's flat affect. He doesn't get animated with his emotions and his facial expressions. And so many times a man who is meant to be a protector and the initiator and the person who wards off evil and expels it, it's inevitable that there's going to be those voices that tells, just like Owen's probably dealing with some amount of shame, I would have to think that Shawn is dealing with exponentially more shame of what happened to his daughter and beating himself up maybe for even marrying Kendra in the first place. I don't know what these thoughts are saying, but those are the types of thoughts that men often have thrown at them in their own heads. So to tie all this up, I want to take it back to Scripture, because Scripture helps me so much and it's so much of a foundation of who I am. And I want you to know who I am, and I want to know who you are, and make this a back and forth thing. So let's tie it up with the idea of forgiveness. Now, one of the things as a therapist I know is that forgiveness is essential to somebody's healing, whether they're a Christian or any other faith. If you look at just pure secular research that has no tie to any particular religion, it's going to tell you that forgiveness is one of the biggest traits, or one of the biggest hurdles, and one of the most necessary steps in healing from anything you've been through. So nobody's going to argue that forgiveness is somehow not necessary. So let's talk about it in this case. First of all, he eventually is going to need to have some level of forgiveness toward Kendra. Both of them are, Shawn and Owen. They're both going to have to get to some level of forgiveness for her. And it's probably going to be like layers of an onion, where they forgive this amount and then later they realize there's even more to go to that, or even more forgiveness to go. But then also, both of them are at some level going to have to forgive themselves. And I think probably Shawn more so than Owen. But if you don't forgive yourself, you can continue to beat yourself up, and you might have let the other person, quote unquote, off your mental hook. But if you keep on punishing yourself for what you think you should have done differently, you're going to stay just as much in a prison as if you were still holding the grudge against somebody else. So forgiveness is also one of those things. As a therapist, I never want to push somebody into that, because if you if you quote unquote pressure them into forgiving somebody, it's not even real. And then they're just saying the words, but they don't really mean it down deep. And then they could even get more tied up because they thought they forgave, but they really didn't. And then all the shame happens even more. So I never am going to push somebody to forgive. I will keep bringing up the idea for them to have it as seeds in their mind. But I also will say, don't do this until you're ready. You got to go through the grief process of actually being ready to forgive, because you can't just immediately do it. A lot of churches get that wrong, and they want you to immediately forgive the person and move on. That ain't how it works. I'm sorry. That's where spiritual abuse comes in. So that wraps up the series on unknown number. What I leave out? What do you want to know more about? We can tie it into a bunch of different ways. So I appreciate you guys being here. Keep on being legendary, and we'll see you next time.